Prince Edward pulled off something that almost nobody saw coming. And the way he did it is more interesting than what he actually secured, because for years Charles had been operating under an assumption that turned out to be completely wrong. He believed that as king, he held the final say over royal property, royal titles, and anything attached to them. On the 25th of March 2026, he received a written confirmation that he does not. What makes this situation genuinely significant is that Edward did not just win a dispute. He exposed a fundamental misunderstanding at the top of the monarchy about where sovereign authority actually ends. And he did it by being the one person in the family who had apparently kept every single document. Here is where it starts. Queen Elizabeth II, before she died in September 2022, made a series of decisions that were extremely deliberate. She had watched the family change, she had watched pressure build around money and titles and control, and she knew what she wanted locked in before she was gone. The Duke of Edinburgh title was going to Edward. That was not up for debate. That title had defined Prince Philip for more than 70 years. It was the shape of his entire public life. Elizabeth made sure it would pass to the son who stayed steady, stayed out of scandal, and never brought harm to the monarchy. That promise was fulfilled in April 2023 when Charles officially handed Edward the title. If the story ended there, everything would be straightforward. It does not end there. The title was only half of what Edward inherited. The other half was Bagshot Park, a 120-room Tudor Gothic mansion sitting on 51 acres inside Windsor Great Park. It is the seat of the dukedom. In her final years, Elizabeth signed a letter of intent that tied that estate directly to the Edinburgh title. That letter was witnessed by Philip as he was dying. He knew exactly why it mattered. Without it, Edward could lose everything attached to the title. So Elizabeth locked it in. The title and the estate were meant to stay together, clearly documented, clearly witnessed. After she was gone, a completely different approach took over inside the palace. Charles had believed for years that modernization gave him the right to review everything, to cut costs, to restructure, and if necessary, to reclaim. By 2026, that belief had turned into action. There were reviews of royal leases, financial audits, quiet pressure being applied to change how family members lived. Bagshot Park became a target. Edward had received the dukedom in 2023 after waiting his entire life for it. He watched his father carry that title for decades. He finally stepped into that role, and within 3 years, the same institution that gave it to him began trying to strip away the home that gave the title its meaning. Without Bagshot Park, the Duke becomes a name without a base, a title without grounding. What makes this worse, when you look at the actual details, is what Edward took on when he accepted that estate. Bagshot Park was in serious disrepair when it was offered to him. When the army chaplain left in 1996, the building was worn out and had been ignored for years. The Crown Estate had been considering turning it into a hotel or conference center. That is how little practical value it held at the time. Instead, it was handed to Edward under a lease signed in March 1998. The terms were clear: £5,000 a year for 50 years. That low rent came with a serious obligation. He had to restore the place, not gradually, but quickly. He did it. He invested £1.36 million of his own private money, earned before he became a full-time working royal. The total cost of repairs reached nearly £3 million. The Crown Estate covered part of it, but Edward carried a substantial portion. Once the work was done, his rent was increased to £90,000 a year. The National Audit Office confirmed that figure as market value. Compare that to his brother Andrew, who lived at Royal Lodge for years without ever paying market rate. The National Audit Office documented it. One brother followed the rules and paid his way, the other did not. And now the institution that had allowed that double standard was turning its attention to the brother who had done everything correctly. Edward went further in securing his position. In 2007, he paid £5 million through his company Eclipse Nominees Limited to extend the lease to 150 years. His agreement gave him the right to sell the lease and retain the profit. He built security. He built long-term control. By 2026, the same property was worth around £30 million. If the Crown Estate retrieved it, it could be sold or leased at significant profit. So when pressure started building on Edward to give it up, the financial motive was sitting in plain sight. A £30 million asset is not an abstract consideration. This is where Philip's role becomes impossible to overlook. He saw this coming. That is why he made sure the letter of intent was witnessed and formally recorded. Philip had spent over 70 years watching how the monarchy operated behind closed doors. He had watched the institution move quietly and efficiently against people it no longer found useful. He was not going to allow that to happen to his youngest son. So as he was dying, he put his name on a document specifically designed to make it difficult. He understood that without it, Edward would have no protection when the pressure arrived. By the time March 2026 arrived, Edward's legal file rested on 3 strong points: the original lease, showing his financial investment, the letter signed by Elizabeth and witnessed by Philip tying Bagshot Park to the dukedom for his lifetime, and 20 years of records demonstrating that he had maintained the estate at a standard that saved the monarchy money. Even with all of that, one fact made the situation genuinely dangerous. Charles controls the system. He controls the structure that can make life inside the monarchy extremely difficult without breaking any formal rules. Nothing was guaranteed. Then it became personal. Earlier in 2026, before any lawyers walked in with a dossier, a palace official arrived at the Edinburgh household with a clipboard and a quiet instruction. The visit came from the office of Queen Camilla. It was described as a jewelry audit, a routine review, a national heritage check. What it actually meant was straightforward. Someone had come to count and question jewelry that Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had worn as her own for 25 years. And at the center of that audit was one piece, the Anthem tiara. This was not a random vault item. It was made specifically for Sophie's wedding in 1999, commissioned by Queen Elizabeth II herself. It was built using 4 antique elements shaped in a honeysuckle design drawn from the private collection of Queen Victoria. For nearly 2 decades, it was the only tiara Sophie ever wore. That detail matters more than people tend to register. Sophie was never given open access to the grand state tiaras the way other senior royals were. That was understood inside the family, never said loudly, but clear. She was not placed at the center. The Anthem tiara was her one piece. Take that away, and she has nothing. Camilla's argument arrived through legal language, but the underlying message was sharp. Because the tiara incorporated stones from Queen Victoria's era, it could potentially be classified as crown property. That would mean it should be held in the central royal vault and issued only for official use. Sophie would no longer own the tiara she wore on her wedding day. She would have to request permission to put it on. And the logic behind that argument was genuinely dangerous in scope. If it held, it would not stop with one tiara. It would open the door to reclaiming dozens of personal gifts Elizabeth had made across her 70-year reign. It would not stop at Sophie. It would reach across the family. It would circle back to Camilla herself, whose own jewelry collection came directly from royal sources. Apply the same rule uniformly, and her collection sits in the same position. Edward's legal team saw that immediately, but this situation carried something even darker behind it. The public had seen this pattern before. After Princess Diana died, a diamond and emerald necklace given to her by the Queen Mother on her wedding day in 1981 was returned to the royal vault. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Camilla had it taken out, redesigned into a brooch, and wore it publicly. The reaction was immediate, and it stayed in people's memory. That memory had not gone away, and now the same pattern appeared to be playing out again. Edward did not stay quiet. His lawyers responded with a document that cut the argument off at its foundation. A deed of gift signed by Elizabeth in 1999, stating that the Anthem tiara was classified as a private wedding present, not a state loan, not a shared asset, not something held in trust. It belonged to Sophie. Elizabeth had also awarded Sophie the Royal Victorian Order, an honor given personally by the monarch for direct service. Look at what that combination represents. Elizabeth gave her a wedding tiara, a personal honor, and then signed a legal document confirming the tiara was hers. That is a queen making a clear statement about trust and relationship. Edward had gone further still. In 1999, he worked with royal jewelers to create a matching set of black and white pearl jewelry for Sophie, a necklace and earrings designed to sit precisely with the Anthem tiara. The materials were funded through the crown, but Edward held the design rights. His lawyers argued that the tiara and the pearl set formed a single artistic unit connected to his own design work. You cannot remove the tiara without breaking that unit. That added another layer to his legal position, and sitting beneath all of the legal arguments was something deeply personal. Sophie wore that tiara on her wedding day. In October 2019, at a reception at Buckingham Palace marking the work of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust, she was giving a speech in front of senior royals and guests. In the middle of it, she turned toward Queen Elizabeth and said the word that slipped out naturally, "Mama." It was unplanned. It showed exactly how she saw her. The woman who had signed that deed of gift was the woman she called her mother, and now another woman was attempting to take that away. By the afternoon of March 25th, 2026, the situation reached a breaking point. Edward's legal team delivered a direct warning. If the claim on the tiara was not dropped by the end of the day, they would release private letters written by Elizabeth. Letters clearly stating her wish for Sophie to retain full ownership of her personal jewelry. And according to those close to the situation, those letters included words about Camilla, Elizabeth's long, careful distance toward her, the years it took before any real acceptance, the tension that never fully disappeared. Charles had spent years rebuilding Camilla's public image. Those letters could dismantle that work very quickly. This was no longer a dispute about a tiara. It was about control, reputation, and what the historical record would eventually say. By that evening, the Anthem tiara remained in Sophie's possession, but after the audit and the legal pressure, Edward moved it. He had it secured in a high-security private safe under the direct control of his own security team. Nobody was going to quietly reclassify it without an overt confrontation. Edward had drawn his line. What came next was not legal. It was personal, and it walked through the door in the form of Princess Anne. When Anne entered the private room that afternoon, there was no small talk. She went directly to the point. But to understand why her presence carried particular weight, you have to look at what had changed in the years before it. Anne and Sophie were not always close. As recently as 2021, it was clear to anyone watching that Anne kept her distance. She does not perform warmth she does not feel. Then April 2021 happened. Philip died. That loss changed the structure inside the family. Both Anne and Sophie stepped forward to support Elizabeth in her final year. They began seeing each other almost every day. The distance between them closed. By the time of Elizabeth's funeral in September 2022, the change was visible. As they stood waiting for the coffin, Sophie reached out and placed a quiet hand on Anne's back. A small gesture, real trust. By March 2026, that quiet connection had become something protective and ready to act. Anne told Charles that if he allowed private gifts from their mother to be questioned, reclassified, or retrieved, then the word of a monarch would mean nothing. Then she said the thing that stopped the room. If their mother's signature on a lease or a deed of gift is not worth the paper it is written on today, then his signature will be worth even less tomorrow. She was not attacking Charles personally. She was attacking the logic of the position he was being pushed toward. A king's authority only functions if people trust what he signs. That trust does not originate with him. It comes from every monarch before him. Break it, and everything weakens. She had already reviewed the Bagshot Park documents herself. She knew what Edward had paid, what he had signed, and what the Crown estate had accepted. Her position was direct. Edward paid for that home. The Crown estate took his money under those terms. That agreement stands. Anne did not treat the tiara and the house as separate disputes. She made clear they were the same fight. Both were things Elizabeth had personally given, backed by signed documents. Both were now being challenged using the same argument. And once that door opens, nothing Elizabeth signed remains safe. She understood the personal dimension, too. Sophie had lost her mother when she was young. Over the years, Elizabeth had become the closest thing she had to one. Anne had lost Philip in 2021 and Elizabeth in 2022. She knows what it means when the people who defined your life are gone and all that remains are the things they left behind. When the tiara and the home were targeted, Anne was not reading paperwork. She was watching something being taken from someone who had already lost enough. She had seen this pattern before. She had been close to Diana. She had watched Diana's position erode slowly through the removal of her royal status, the isolation, the loss of support. She saw a woman give everything to the monarchy and get pushed aside. She was not going to stay quiet a second time. Then she went further. She told Charles that if Camilla did not stop, she would act, not privately. She would oversee a full audit of the Queen's household, not just basic financial numbers, but everything. Expenses, staffing, allocations connected to Camilla's office. That threat landed with weight because Anne is the one person in the family who could make it real and be taken seriously. She has a long record of financial discipline and institutional rigor. When she says she will expose something, people with knowledge of how she operates understand she's not performing. She also raised Edward's children. There had been quiet pressure to move James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor into full private status earlier than planned, meaning a loss of the protected royal position and the security that comes with it. Anne blocked it. She made clear that this decision belongs to their parents and to the children themselves, and not to Camilla's office. This mattered to her for a reason she did not need to spell out. Anne chose a private life for her own children, Peter and Zara, years ago, but that was her choice, made without pressure. What she was seeing now was different. By the time that meeting ended, Charles sat with two options, both of them damaging. He could back Camilla and risk breaking the credibility of his own authority by overriding documented decisions his mother had made. Or he could step back and accept that some things Elizabeth set in place are beyond his reach. There was no clean exit. After reviewing the full dossier, Charles's own legal team delivered their conclusion. Edward's position was legally unbreakable. Every element held. No royal order could override it. Charles had lost. For years he had operated on the belief that as the person who granted the dukedom in April 2023, he retained control over what came with it. His own lawyers told him in writing that he did not. What Elizabeth gave Edward was not a temporary arrangement. It was a legal inheritance outside his authority to revoke. There was something else in the file that hit harder. The letter witnessed by Philip. Charles knew his mother had always protected Edward and Sophie. He knew where her loyalty sat, but he had not known that Philip, in his final stage of life, had formally backed that protection in writing. That detail changed the character of the whole situation. This had not been Elizabeth's decision alone. It had been both of them, together, in a document designed specifically to survive the next reign. Despite all of that, Camilla did not immediately back down. Her position was that the same rules should apply across the royal family, that private gifts like the tiara should be brought under central review, that properties like Bagshot Park should operate within the palace's oversight structure. She wanted everything drawn back under central control, and Edward and Sophie, with their own secured home and their own capacity to operate independently, were proving difficult to pull back in line. The pressure on them looked increasingly like an effort to remove the very things that gave them their independence. As a result, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted in ways that were visible to the people working inside it. Staff began choosing sides. People who had worked around Sophie for years showed quiet support for the Edinburgh household. Resentment toward Camilla's office spread through the corridors. Private discussions became less contained. Documents, internal notes, and internal thinking sat closer to exposure than they had ever been before. The palace, known for its institutional discipline, was divided from within. One person familiar with the situation described it simply: the king is being led into a situation with no clean outcome. He is being pushed to choose between his wife's demands and his mother's final documented decisions. Neither choice leaves him without damage. Outside the palace, the potential public dimension was no easier. At a time when people across the country are dealing with rising costs, the image of a king attempting to reclaim a home from a brother who paid personally to restore it would not have been received with sympathy. That image would not have been forgiven quickly. According to reports, Charles eventually moved outside the formal legal process. He wrote a private note, a handwritten message sent directly to Bagshot Park, asking for a family meeting. The response he received made the situation plain. Edward refused to meet unless his full legal team was present. That answer changed everything. Edward was no longer operating as the younger brother trying to hold the peace. He was operating as someone who understood precisely what was at risk and would not give anything up without formal protection. Once that line is drawn, it does not retract. Late on the 25th of March 2026, a formal note was sent from the office of the Master of the Jewel House to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. It was short and direct. The anthem tiara would remain under her exclusive private control. At the same time, the review of Bagshot Park was quietly closed. The official language described it as recognition of the Edinburgh household's role in maintaining the estate. Inside the palace, nobody misread what had just happened. The crown had stepped back. Everything Edward held was confirmed. The title, the home, the tiara, all of it stood exactly where Elizabeth had placed it. And that confirmation changed the balance inside the family permanently. The dispute was over, but the record it produced was not. That formal note will sit in the palace archives long after everyone involved is gone. When it is read in the future, the meaning will be clear. A claim was made, it failed, and the institution was required to acknowledge that in writing. The relationship between Charles and Edward has changed completely. What the public will see going forward is the appearance of unity. Two brothers standing side by side at engagements, maintaining the surface that the institution requires. Inside the family, everyone will know what actually happened. That one of them had to use the law to protect himself from the other. That does not go away. The structure of the monarchy has shifted because of it. There are now two clear centers of weight. At the palace, Charles and Camilla continue pushing their version of a streamlined, controlled institution. Away from that center, another group holds a different line. Princess Anne, Edward, and Sophie, with quiet support, from William and Catherine, protecting what was built in the previous reign and refusing to let it be rewritten. For James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor, this moment will not fade. They watched their father fight without public drama, through documents, through preparation, through legal precision, and they watched him force the institution to retreat. One day, James will carry the Duke of Edinburgh title, the same one his grandfather carried for over 70 years. But he will carry it with a different understanding than Philip did. He will know that the institution that gives can also try to take back. That knowledge does not produce loyalty. It produces caution, and caution will shape how he stands inside that system for the rest of his life. Charles has his monarchy, he has his structure and his authority. What he no longer has is the full trust of the brother who stood quietly for decades, paid his own way, and asked for nothing except to keep what had been given to him. That loss does not appear in any formal document, but it will show over time. And long after the files are closed and the silence settles, that is the part that remains. There is one more thread in this story that deserves to be followed to its end, because it says something about how this family handles accountability once the formal processes have concluded. In the weeks following the March 25th confirmation, the palace communications team faced a practical problem. The public had noticed the audit visit, the early rumors of a property review, and then the sudden administrative silence that followed. When an institution that normally issues statements about everything issues nothing at all, about a visible dispute, the absence of communication becomes its own kind of signal. Journalists and royal correspondents who had been tracking the Edinburgh household situation since early 2026 understood that something significant had been resolved without any official explanation of what it was. The palace's response was to say as little as possible while maintaining the appearance of normal operations. Official schedules continued without interruption. Edward and Sophie appeared at their assigned engagements with no visible sign of what had occurred. Charles and Camilla appeared at theirs. The surface held. It almost always does with this family. The discipline required to maintain appearances in the middle of a serious internal rupture is one of the few things every member of the institution genuinely excels at, regardless of their other differences. But the surface holding does not mean the substance is resolved. It means the substance is being carried internally out of sight by the people who were directly involved in it. For Sophie specifically, the aftermath of the tiara audit carried a particular weight that had nothing to do with legal titles or property valuations. The anthem tiara had been questioned, counted, cataloged, and subjected to a formal review process that treated it as potentially not hers. Even with the outcome confirmed in writing, the experience of having that happen to something she received on her wedding day from a woman she called her mother does not wash off with a formal note. The note restored the legal position. It did not restore the feeling that went with that position before the audit arrived. People close to Sophie describe her response to the resolution as composed and private, which is how she handles most things. She has never operated through public statements about internal family matters, and she did not begin doing so over this. But the people around her in the months following March 2026 noticed that her interactions with Camilla's office, which had never been particularly warm, carried a cooler formality than they had before. Not hostile in any way that could be documented or quoted. Simply, more precisely distant. Anne's involvement in the March 25th meeting added another layer to the aftermath. She had stated, in direct terms, to the king himself that she was prepared to conduct a formal audit of Camilla's household operations if the pressure on Edward and Sophie continued. That statement did not disappear when the dispute was resolved. It entered the institutional memory of everyone who was present or who learned of it through the accounts that circulated afterward. Anne had named the specific consequence she was prepared to impose. The fact that she did not need to impose it does not make the statement less significant. It means that the next time a question arises about the boundaries of Camilla's operational reach, there is a known answer sitting just behind it. This is how Anne tends to operate when something genuinely matters to her. She does not make threats she does not intend to carry out. The people inside that institution who have worked alongside her for long enough know that. So when she says something in a private meeting of that weight, it functions as a standing condition rather than a one-time warning. She has essentially told the palace that a particular line exists and named the consequence of crossing it. The line does not need to be re-established each time. It is simply there. For Charles, the weeks following March 25th involved a kind of administrative reckoning that went beyond the specific question of Bagshot Park and the anthem tiara. His own legal team had told him in writing that his authority had limits he had not fully accounted for. That is not a comfortable piece of information for a king to receive about his own institutional power. And it arrived not as a theoretical observation, but as a practical conclusion reached while examining a real dispute with his own brother. What the situation ultimately revealed was something about the nature of the inheritance Elizabeth left behind. She had been extraordinarily precise in the final years of her reign about what she wanted locked into documented form. The letter about Bagshot Park, the deed of gift for the tiara, the letter of intent tying the estate to the dukedom. Each of these was not simply an expression of affection. Each was a legal instrument designed to survive beyond her, designed to hold against pressure she understood would eventually come. She had watched this institution long enough to know how it moves when it decides something needs to move, and she had taken steps through signed documents with proper witnesses to ensure that the people she wanted protected would have something concrete to stand on when the pressure arrived. Philip had understood the same thing. His signature on the letter of intent, placed there as he was dying, was not a sentimental gesture. It was a deliberate act by a man who had spent over 70 years watching the machinery of the monarchy operate, and who understood that informal assurances evaporate the moment the person who gave them is gone. He put his name on the document because he knew a document lasts in a way that a conversation does not. The combination of Elizabeth's precision and Philip's foresight produced the legal architecture that Edward's lawyers built their case on. Neither of them was alive to see it work, but it worked exactly as they had designed it to work, against exactly the kind of pressure they had anticipated, in exactly the form they had prepared for. That is the part of this story that sits longest after everything else has been processed. Two people in the last stages of their lives, both of whom understood deeply how this institution operates, quietly building a structure that would protect their youngest son and his wife from a challenge they would never live to see resolved. They saw it coming. They prepared for it, and their preparation held. Charles has his monarchy. The institution continues. And somewhere in the archives of Bagshot Park, in a private safe that no palace official can access without an explicit confrontation with the law, the anthem tiara sits exactly where Elizabeth intended it to be from the